All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Comprehensive Guidance to Governing Your AI Identities and Identity Access Management, brought to you by Bravura Security and intiGrow. My name is Carolyn Evans, and I'll be your host for today's session. Before we get started, just wanted to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording after the session. We have a fantastic lineup for you today with our expert speakers, Ian Ray, who is our CTO here at Bravura Security, Brian Christ, who is our Senior Solutions Engineer at Bravura Security, and Jim Skidmore, who is the VP Solutions Group at intiGrow. Ian, Brian, and Jim will be discussing how you can secure your data in the age of AI. We want this to be an interactive session, so please feel free to submit any questions that you have at any time in the chat function or the Q&A function of Zoom. And we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. Without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to our speakers. Take it away.
Hey, Carolyn, thank you so much for the introductions. I just want to reiterate that we're grateful for those of you that are attending today. This is fourth or fifth in a series that we have been conducting on the advancements of artificial intelligence, especially as it relates to the cybersecurity landscape. One of the things that we want to do today before we get started here into the slide content is we do have a brief poll that we would like for folks on the line to participate in. If you could, if the screen's popped up for you, just we'll take about 60 seconds to give folks a chance to read the questions and provide their feedback. So we'll do that right now. Okay, I think we have closed the poll. So if you didn't get a chance to chime in, sorry about that. But we do appreciate those who have participated. Carolyn, if you want, can you share the poll results with folks, or is that already happening? Maybe it's already happening.
That should be happening. You should be able to see it.
Okay, yep, there we go. Okay, so how well are you keeping up with AI trends and what kind of AI you're using? This is good feedback. We appreciate it. Some mixed results here, so it wasn't really clear to us going into this what we would see, but it looks like it's a pretty mixed bag. And so hopefully today, as we go through some of this content, a little bit of at least in terms of what you know, will shift a little bit. So this first slide up here that we're looking at, we've consistently presented this over the last, like I said, this is the fourth or fifth in a series that we've done on artificial intelligence. We've consistently presented this slide as sort of an, hey, here's where we are in the world of AI. Generative AI is the thing that's making the most noise. So folks hear about ChatGPT, or they hear about Midjourney or Stable Diffusion. And so just a quick kind of reminder of the differences here between generative AI and AGI is generative AI is singularly focused on a specific task. So ChatGPT obviously involved in dialogue, creative writing, and those kinds of things. AGI is really the next big milestone, which is I often give the analogy that it's like the computer on Star Trek, right? You just ask a question. It doesn't really matter what discipline of knowledge that's in question. It just gives you the answer. And so I think that piece is fast approaching. Jim, I know you keep up with this landscape somewhat aggressively, at least as much as you can. That's the trick, right? But when you read the tea leaves, you know, we've placed the "you are here" bubble sort of in between because it seems like it's probably imminent. What are you seeing out there, Jim?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to decide what innovation may come along that changes the pillars completely. But We're basically finding that people are pretty new into this because we're obviously building global scale IAM solutions and doing planning, strategy and compliance planning for a lot of enterprise clients. Um, they're just kind of, I guess, at the tipping point, right? A lot of folks, we're starting to get into some posture and policy development. We're talking a little bit about, um, some controls in places, but I don't think in a lot of cases folks have dove in as deep as we will today with regard to how this will affect policy. Um, so I don't want to open Pandora's box and let the cow out of the barn already, but are looking at the pools, the lakes, the ponds, understanding the data sets very well, looking at potentially impact analysis kinds of stuff or other stuff. So it's kind of we're sort of at the advent, I guess, and people are, and I think the poll sort of backed that up a little bit, Brian, maybe. Um, people are getting into it, but they're not headlong into it yet because I think of a lot of the other day-to-day issues we all have to deal with. So
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I was actually going to ask your opinion on what you thought. I mean, you deal with, our focus here at Reverse Security is very narrowly focused on a particular segment of cybersecurity. I know that at intiGrow you do a bit more in terms of breadth, and so what you're saying is that it's a mixed bag. Folks are coming to you with varying levels of knowledge about AI.
yeah, I mean, it might be anything from, what should the generative chat GPT generation and things mean to us on out to, holy cow, some of my developers are getting, and Ian's smiling as I say this, AI assistants and other components that we're woefully worried about.
Yeah,
So everybody's in a little different place.
so I'm glad you brought that up. Let's not get ahead of ourselves because we are definitely going
Sorry.
down there. Haley, Carolyn, if you would, we go ahead and move to the next slide real quick. I'll talk to this, but at some point I want to hand this over to Ian to wrap up a conversation on what we're seeing here in front of us. So I would say at least 4 or 5 years ago, I was talking to folks about the landscape of identities. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, organizations were really, I would say, not even really managing their employee population very well. There was a fraction of them that were doing it, and really things like contractor, contingent workforce, um, they were an afterthought if they were a thought at all. And so, as time has evolved, it's my perception that organizations aren't really keeping up with the various kinds of identities that you should be concerned about and governing. I am somewhat optimistic that we're seeing folks now start talking about non-human accounts, service accounts, things that applications tend to be powered by. So that's good, but I get the sense that they're still behind quite a bit. And so, Haley, Carol, if you'll jump over to the next slide, I want to ask Ian. What is it that you see? So if we see folks not dealing with these services, non-human accounts, how is an AI assistant? So that's going to be largely the topic of conversation today. How is an AI assistant different than something like a non-human service account? Can you maybe unpack that in just a little few words here?
Yeah, for sure. Because also, this is where AI is being introduced to many different things. And so some of them can be handled under, our existing practices and whatnot. But there's also kind of a new distinct area that I'll get into here. Now, so again, IAM platforms tend to have historically been focused on your consumers, partners, employees, and the people that drive our businesses forward here. But more and more, as people are looking at, modern risks, modern attacks, they're starting to see that, say, like the service accounts are key weak points. And that's starting to become a lot more visible as people are, trying to make sure improve good governance for the systems as a whole that they are tasked with supporting. And so service counts have historically been kind of murky, and now they're becoming a lot more visible. And again, devices, endpoints, and when you have the, making sure that people have access to those administrative interfaces, those ones that control all the devices that underpin how your companies operate, those are, in the last number of years, those two have been, getting a lot more attention due to, the level of access that they have in your organizations. But what really kind of sets, and AI is being introduced to your devices. Like pretty soon we're going to have AIs operating for us on our laptops, definitely on our phones. You're already seeing that with the work that Google and Apple and Microsoft are doing. They're pushing AIs onto your devices and also too on your endpoints. And many software applications are adding AI support to them. So that's your services. And that's the stuff that often can be covered in many ways by your existing practices. These tools tend to work with the data that is in those devices and for purposes specific to those devices or those applications. Where AI assistants are a little different, though, is we as people, we work across a range of different applications and a range of different devices. What makes us valuable is that ability to bridge the information and bridge the tasks across those different systems and applications. That's why we're needed. Otherwise, the applications would have just handled this stuff. And so but us as humans, we're feeling taxed, we're feeling stretched. We all want to do a few more things than, what the day might allow for. And also there's some areas where we might not be, all that comfortable in. Maybe it's something new to us. Maybe it's something that we're growing on. And that's where many people are trying to see how assistance can help us fill in those gaps, fill in the weak spots that we have, or the things that we don't have time for. And we're just starting to see this with some of the assistance that people are creating in chatbots for topics at work, helping to create marketing content, helping people to use your products better, helping staff to reference documentation easier. Those are kind of people just putting their toe in the water, so to speak here. But there's also a set of assistants that are just on the horizon, and some of us have started to use, such as say like coding bots and troubleshooting bots, and bots that really help us on kind of our primary responsibility in a company. And for those bots to excel, they need access to that information that spans the applications and devices. In some ways, those bots need to have a memory that starts to kind of relate and look a lot like our memories. And that's where it becomes easier, as we can not have to remember quite so much and not be tasked with being great across the board. We can start to leverage our assistants to help us out here more and more. And that's where these assistants kind of are a distinct thing between people and software. They're not like the software applications and devices that we've used to date. They're a little different. They're a little bit more like an artificial helper. And they're going to help us to do a number of different things. Many people need a way of doing research and to be able to find out what is happening in their industry, or to research a topic, or there's a problem at hand. People across industries have that kind of a challenge. And also too, certainly with say like higher eds, that's a unique challenge here where they exist largely to do research. And so again, how can those bots be responsible with doing research on both public data sets, but also more and more on proprietary data sets? And just like an assistant, they're gonna generate findings, and they're gonna help you summarize things. They're gonna create a draft that then you can review. And that's something that we can really excel at. We have expertise. We know what we're trying to do as part of the institutions or the businesses that we work for. But we need that help by having those assistants to help us with sort of some of the more mundane tasks, or at least the things that we might not have time for, or sometimes we're just not very good at. And that's where one of the things that we'll be talking about through this webinar is this new entity that needs to be able to see what we see, to be able to access the data that we access. That's just a little different than the applications and devices we've been using today, because they start to approximate what we need, what our memories are. And so it's kind of exciting times here, but also it starts to raise a whole lot of thorny questions that I think we're going to get into a lot more in this presentation here, there, Brian.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Let's hold the thorny questions for just a minute. What I want to do is I want to think back a little bit to the previous slide for just a minute with Jim here. So Ian, thanks for kind of unpacking, what that AI assistant looks like in terms of capabilities. Jim, I want to ask you this question, which is, right before we introduced AI assistants, I was talking about the service accounts and the non-human accounts in the more traditional model. How in your experience, how in your experience do you think organizations are handling that today? In other words, the question is, are they handling it well today? And then the second question I want to kind of springboard off and ask is, eh, yes or no, do you think they're prepared for this new identity type, this AI assistant? So go. Yours to answer there.
That's kind of a loaded one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so service accounts are often dealt with in, what I would call, kind of fragmented areas. It's almost like people that manage multi-cloud environments. We have the technology, obviously, to automate provisioning and deprovisioning, joiner, mover, leaver across different cloud accounts, for example. But oftentimes people don't go the extra. Let me just say, most of the time, nearly all the time, people don't go the extra mile to still look at an authoritative source, uh, kind of directory to help to manage all of that. And it can be a little fragmented depending on what cloud service you're logging into. Unless, sometimes the HR system, for example, say somebody's using an SAP or, an ERP, that may be a little bit more of an authoritative source. But for a lot of the service accounts for standard applications like Workday or others, um, the identity strategy is a little fragmented. And that's concerning because it's about to get a whole lot more complex. And, at the end of the day, if you go, let's say, all the way to the goal line and you do the automation so that we can automatically provision, deprovision users all the way through to, the account stakeholder on the other side of the cloud, bravo. And, you've done well. And if you're still using an authoritative source to do all of your governance within the organization, then that's an awesome thing, right? You're doing access recertification or attestation, as we call it, and everything else. But for most people, that is not the case. And as I might have tipped off in the first kind of snippet of information earlier, I am woefully afraid of these AI assistants. And I think our clients and folks around the world really need to be thinking about the potential that they have, because we are not governing them, and I'm not aware of any customer that is governing them today. And I don't even think people know where they all are, especially in the hands of a lot of the technologists, developers, and sysadmins and others out there that are starting to use the technology to automate their daily lives. And that can be, as Ian stated earlier, anything from auto-generating code to upgrading if you're doing a firmware update or anything in your OS, which is basically going to expose a lot of PII from your machine to the network, from the company to your machine, to the external internet, to any number of use cases that you can throw out there that are potentially very dangerous. So
Okay, so let me summarize what I think I heard. I think I heard service accounts, non-human accounts in a
Yep.
traditional sense. It's fragmented. It would be fair to say most organizations still aren't handling that well. And then to add to that, you're really concerned that folks are ill prepared for things like AI assistants. Am I
Yeah,
characterizing that fairly?
I think it depends on the company. If you have a new organization or newer and you decide that all we're going to do, we don't have legacy applications, I don't have 45 AD forests, I don't have, all of these existing legacy assets, then life becomes a lot more manageable and simpler. But for a lot of larger organizations, they do have a lot of the legacy components that they have to think about, which basically turns what I would call a star schema into a snowflake, right? We have dependencies all over the place. We're not sure what we can even get rid of. When you're kind of in that mode, it makes things extremely difficult to manage. And it makes it difficult even just to keep, standard, as we say, orphans out of the LDAP, because if I'm not sure if I need somebody, it may be questioned at the audit, but I'm going to leave them there just in case, right? Just so I don't, take a hit on that. And we do see lots of behavior like that. Also, it's an ongoing challenge to always, continue to redo role modeling and to do attribute development if the identities are, if you have new categories and classifications in your organization or stuff like that. So it becomes very difficult to continually audit, analyze, and recreate your strategy as you go along. And for a lot of folks that, their identity assets may be a decade old or so. And it's difficult. People leave organizations. They may have had a thought leader who was working on something, and they're not able to administer it to that degree anymore, or what have you. But yeah, it's a challenge, and it's going to be an ongoing challenge as far as we see it currently. And there are exceptions, right? There are outstanding, best practice focused, best of breed organizations, but for the larger part, it's extremely difficult to keep up, and they just keep growing new cloud share assets and keep signing up for new applications and keep, widening the playing field instead of narrowing it to kind of get control of it. So
I would definitely agree with that.
yeah.
Haley, Carolyn, if you would just go ahead and jump us over onto slide 7. Yeah. So Ian, characterized. Jim, I think you made it clear that most folks aren't prepared for this. Ian introduced us to kind of the concept of an AI assistant. This is just a thought-provoking slide here that's intended to give you an idea of what those AI assistants look like, different kinds of verticals where you're going to find this stuff. And we're ultimately just wanting here to tease out the risks we'll talk about here in a minute. But again, just to start thinking about what does it mean when you have something like a legal assistant as an AI assistant? What kinds of things are they going to get access to that is really quite sensitive? So I won't read the slide for you, but I think you get the idea that in order for these AI assistants to be effective, they have to, in turn, just like a human being, be granted access to data that is oftentimes super confidential in nature. If you want to go ahead and skip on over to the next slide, we'll talk about that a little bit. So again, these AI assistants are going to need access to data, sometimes broad in nature, sometimes sensitive in nature. Ian, Jim, I'll let either one of y'all jump in. I know we talked about this slide over the last couple of weeks pretty exhaustively. And so if one of you wants to just jump in and sort of unpack what's the danger here? What's the real issue with all of this?
Sure. I
Okay, sure.
I can
Fire
start.
away. I'll add color.
So one of the things that I've seen from a number of the groups that I've been talking to here is that they start off with, okay, I can turn on a bot, and I need to give it some of my data, some of my documents, or access to an API. And so then the natural question is, okay, I'm going to give it access to everything that I have access to. Okay, but then rapidly they start to realize, oh, I want to give this so that somebody else can use it, and I don't have access to that other area of the data. So then they're like, well, why don't we just add more data to the AI? We'll just give more of it. And rapidly, if you're not careful here, your AIs start to have access to way more data than what your employees have access to. There's an inversion that develops. And that's certainly far from a sort of a zero trust or a best practice style of an approach of just keep giving more and more data. And in effect, if you don't trust your employees with it, you really should not trust and it's not necessarily, trust is probably the wrong word, but to ensure that people have access to the data that they need for the job that they're that's at hand, that they're not becoming a risk in terms of, being exploited to divulge that data. The AIs certainly can be tricked and divulged to exploiting data. It seems like every week there's new attacks that people frame here about getting them to emit content out. We're at very, very early days there. And so we really have to think carefully about the kind of data that we give those AIs. And that's when you start thinking about the data and the amount of scope that they have. You start actually thinking about, wow, I kind of need to provision them and permission them kind of like a person. I need to kind of apply the same rules that I apply to my employees. And then also too, sometimes there's stuff that might be sensitive enough for the AI shouldn't have standing access to that documentation in case they get exploited. They might only need it for, say, like the quarterly report that they're assisting with in creating, rather than having standing access. And so definitely have that. And then also, as institutions and organizations work more and more together on things, there's a natural need for sharing information, such as, say, like in research institutions, as they need to share information between each other, or even sales departments sharing their customer contact lists for coordinated go-to-marketing strategies. These are things that you definitely would like to have AI assistance with. But are you like, what is the amount of data that you're giving them? Because the AIs, the standard kind of controls around employment agreements and non-disclosure agreements and acceptable use, and the hammers that are criminal and civil liability, those don't apply to AIs. And that's where us as people, we need to put in place a suitable judgment, so that, because those penalties will apply to us as the people who are managing and deploying these AIs. But again, the AIs, these don't affect them. And that is going to be a key challenge for us. We have to make sure that we're not giving them too much data, because that liability transitions onto us as the people managing and deploying them. Otherwise, we're just creating a problem for ourselves. Thoughts, Jim, and with what's been said?
Yeah, that's very well said. The key word here is accountability to me. If we're looking at SOD and we're looking at compliance issues that we have to deal with, and anybody that's on here may have heard of GDPR or dealt with it in the past. Now the US has taken on its own version. India, Japan, many countries around the world are going through kind of the same PII accountability steps. Unless we go forward and do something like Ian said, making an identity role manageable, right, and giving it true access governance privileges, then we're going to have a problem, because AIs right now govern themselves, right, or not, and they kind of give themselves access rights over time to things they think they need to fulfill their mission, regardless of what we think. So at the end of the day, turning those into identities and creating that accountability seems to be the only, non-insane kind of way to deal with this, because people that create the AIs are going to also have to be responsible. I brought up attestation before. How are we going to attest that I'm sending something to an AI to verify that it is who it says it is, for Gramm-Leach-Bliley, for HIPAA, for NERC and FERC, for whatever the issue might be? How will it reply if a human is not responsible for making it reply, because that person is accountable for their AIs? So, this is a tipping point issue right now, and I think it's going to get more and more complex over the course of time, for sure. But this is part of the challenge I think that we face, and I think, as we've all discussed, the AI assistant part of that is really scary, because the PII and corporate data or organizational data or compliance related data, may be on both sides. It may be legible to anybody, even when it needs to be masked legally. It may be in any number of states. That can be really difficult for us to kind of have to deal with. So it's kind of 2 cents, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I just will throw on to this tail of this conversation here that I think one of the things that is tempting with these AI assistants, because the reality is when they're used, they're extremely powerful and have sort of a multiplier effect on personal productivity. And the temptation, right, is to allow them to do more, feed them more, and inherently, what you don't realize is you've violated so the underlying segregation of data and access that a human being would normally think twice about because of these policies and this accountability. Haley, if you would just drop us onto the next slide, because we're going to kind of shift into with that temptation, and with the kind of the blurred lines of not being able to hold someone accountable, not being able to truly vet an AI is or who they claim to be. The right answer tends to be to treat your AI assistants as if they are actual persons. So I think we'll do paper, rock, scissors here, sort of, and I'll let Jim go first because I think Ian started on that. But Jim, do you want to kind of talk to that concept here of right access, right people, right time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little redundant probably from what I was just saying, but it all comes down to we need to create an entity again for accountability. So, we can even temporarily provision an AI. It's not like a seasonal employee, perhaps, or a contractor, but there are times that, we will probably utilize that AI identity, and times we won't, right? So this accountability, and I think people will hear us say this over and over again throughout this discussion, but it needs to be codified in a way that it strongly identifies this personal administrative account, basically this AI being that's out there acting on our behalf. Also, because we have to look at what data it has access to as well, as you stated. So Ian, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but
Yeah, like a common pattern we tend to see with a number of our customers is, yeah, they create personal administrative accounts for their system administrators, and that way they have clear accountability and clear auditability about when those administrative rights are being used. But also, as we're moving into an age of assistance helping you with things, the assistant, you definitely don't want to give them your personal administrative account, or at least probably not. You might want to give them a subset like a personal assistant account that has the right permissions for the tasks that they're assisting you with. And that then kind of inverts the problem space and definitely makes it a little harder. And also too, sometimes, and that's for, say, like you as a person, but then also projects. Like, again, having an assistant that knows the documentation for a project could help greatly with answering questions, being able to help with preparing material, or and went on to allow a project to continue forward, or to track, to assist with tracking progress, or to working through ideas with people if you're bringing somebody new onto the project. Those kind of things could be very valuable, but then would be more of a shared resource across that project. But you also wouldn't want, in either case, those assistants to know about other projects, or to understand and have memory from other people that they've assisted with, because then you have bleeding out of this data, bleeding out of this information. And again, you have this, they have, they to Brian's point, they just keep eating the data up. They love the data. They just keep, because that helps them excel better. But then you have a lot of follow-up challenges about how do you put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, once you realize that data has bled out through a wide range of assistants, and now you have this structural problem where if one of those is compromised, they know all your projects. They, might know all of your customer log files if you gave them access to that to help with system maintenance and everything. So we really need to think about that scope for the purpose and the task that is at hand, and then ensure that you have accountability, that the person who has this personal assistant, they're going to be responsible for that personal assistant. Just like maybe the project manager for the project that has an assistant is going to have to be responsible for that assistant as well, and making some of those decision points about how much data that they should have, just like the people who are involved in here. So it's pretty thought-provoking.
Yeah, one of my biggest fears is that if automation works well enough for folks and they can get a lot of administrative tasks done, that they give it some sort of administrative privilege, almost like a PAM kind of scenario, which would be insanity, but I could definitely see it happening. And then, bar the door, because we'll basically be, giving things access rights at the HAL 2001 Space Odyssey level.
It'd be very convenient to give them all of that access.
It would be. They'll do all my admin for me and all the updates and patching. Yeah.
Convenience versus security. That's going to be a very thought-provoking balance that we are going to have to strike in 2024 here.
But if you're listening, don't do it. Yeah.
Okay. I actually appreciate y'all saying that, and then we'll move on here. But it goes back to that conversation a minute ago where I talked about the temptation, right? And I think we all can understand this because we've all said this. I wish I could clone myself, right? That's really what we're looking to do, is we're looking to multiply our efforts. And if I could clone myself, then that means that there's another individual, and that same individual should be bounded by the same constraints that I'm bound by. And that's really, in order to sort of wrap your mind around how you should treat an AI assistant, you really have to think of them in terms of a human being. If you'll, Haley, Carolyn, advance us to the next slide. With that in mind of, hey, like, we need to treat AI assistants like human beings, like understand that in some ways, maybe they're like I don't know, a dumber version of ourselves, if I could say it that way. But with any kind of identity governance, human being or otherwise, a lot of it's governing that's always going to begin with this conversation of analyzing your risk, and that's really kind of the intention of this slide, is to talk about that. I'll start with you, Jim, on this one. You want to talk about this slide just a hair?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in DPIA, right? I think, if you look at ISACA, if you look at CISA, if you look at a lot of our governing and standard bearing organizations out there, they say things like anyone processing personal data has a duty to assess the risk involved, right? So, and we're giving, as Ian stated earlier, these AIs are just going to keep seeking and swallowing more data all the time, ad infinitum, forever, amen, right? So if an enterprise believes that a planned process is likely to pose a high risk to somebody's personal rights and freedoms, basically in every compliance area, it has a duty to conduct a DPIA. So if you're not familiar with that, we can certainly talk offline for anybody that might be confused by what a data protection impact assessment might look like. But, there is a requirement to assess the impact on somebody's personal privacy by, considering all personal details in cases where data are used and, to automate decision making or other areas. So this is going to be the case on a very large scale. And, I think it's going to be very difficult for folks to monitor, over the course of time. And we're going to need root cause understanding to kind of get to a point where, here's what we're giving access to, and it could potentially involve this, but we need to be thinking about this. And the AI, kind of product companies are actually going through these types of discussions in some cases before customers are even allowed to buy it. So depending on how large the use case is or something like that. So, because ethical is a key word, but if you do not understand the impact potentially that this AI will have in its use case and what you're giving it access to, I suggest you think again, or maybe take another breath and go back through what the potential risks are that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jim. I'm going to move us along to the next slide here just for the sake of time. I think we could probably talk about the data risk side of things for a while, but Carolyn, if you want to move us on to the next slide and focus a little bit on that big, bad, scary word, compliance and regulation, and kind of move the conversation over to what do we do about this? Like, so we've kind of hinted at some of the things, but kind of get a little more specific here. Ian, I'm going to turn this one over to you to talk about some of these bullets. At a high level, just floated the idea that you should be, treating these AI assistants like human beings. This is sort of the practical side of that. Ian, if you want to go ahead and maybe cover this for us, that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure. So with these AIs, obviously you're going to have to control the level of access that they have to your data and your APIs. That's the AI's eyes and ears to the world is APIs and the data that you feed it. And so it's going to definitely require careful thought around this assistant. How much access should it have? And we're going to have to make sure that that access is appropriate for the purpose and the role that it has. And if you're uncertain, absolutely assess the data impact here. And then these AIs, just like service counts, if you don't track them, they're going to get very murky. And then in 10, 15 years, you're going to be like, what is this? Why is it here? Do I still need it? Will I break anything? That's where getting ahead of the curve and at least having a proper inventory of these items and being able to periodically review and make sure that they have a clear owner, somebody who's responsible for them, is going to, I think, be absolutely critical here to make sure that you're not leaking access or that, you have these hidden little areas that an attacker could then ask questions and exploit. And as we get tempted by the convenience that these assistants can give, establishing clear separation of the duties about what these AIs can actually act upon, what they can do as an assistant of us versus what needs us to approve and review before action is taken is going to come really, really quickly. There's tools right now that we're experimenting with that I'm personally using that have a rudimentary form of this, where it's basically asking you, can I do this before doing this command? And yes, right now I do, yes. But its audit logging is non-existent. Its accountability is non-existent. How do you tell really the difference between what the decisions I made versus the decisions that the assistant made? Those are going to be key things here. And it's going to really test us to try and think through around how do we separate this, but also too, separation of duty from a data perspective as well. As people are creating these assistants, they're going to want to feed the assistant's data, but you can't feed it potentially sensitive information, customer confidential stuff with PII data in it. You might need to scrub that. Now you might want another assistant to do the scrubbing of that. So that's where, again, it starts to look a lot like how people do things, where you have an assistant that is curating and creating an acceptable data set to hand off to another assistant who will be applying that data set for a different purpose. Those are things that I think are going to come pretty quickly for us here as we're all faced with this. And that's where, again, coming back and thinking of them very similarly to how people do this and how we compartmentalize and how we make sure that people remain responsible and accountable will, I think, be some of those those truisms that we fall back on here with the AIs and help us as a guiding light. And then also too, like with these assistants, if they have standing access, that's a potential problem, just like for people. Like if they have access to a data set that they only need for 1 or 2 days out of the year, why do they have standing access to that data? That could be exploited. They could be coerced. They could be socially engineered. And that is something where if they just don't have access, then they can't be attacked like that. And I think that's where, least privilege is going to be a key topic. And then in spades, as organizations, as higher eds, as enterprises need to share data with each other more and more to do, to drive our research, our capabilities, our products forward here. And also to our sales programs, we're going to want to share information. And how do you make sure that the other side is responsibly handling that data? That's also where too, how do you redact the information so it's acceptable for somebody else to be given it and without putting you at risk? All key questions that right now have kind of been kind of murky, but I think are going to come to the forefront very, very quickly as people, see the real business and organizational value that these assistants bring in terms of cost savings and efficiencies. It's just going to be, you can't ignore that value. It's just how do you apply this at scale securely? Because these are going to be fun questions for this next year.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ian. Jim, do you want to have any final comments on this slide before we move on?
No, I just wanted to call out one term that Ian used in the beginning of this I think is very important. Log event management will not be available, auditable, monitorable, or capable even to feed into any kind of SIM or however you aggregate your data for compliance or risk management reasons. So I think that's just an important punchline to remember.
Yep. We're at the very early days, and there's some improvement these assistants are going to require for us to really trust and hold them accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, having said that, if Carolyn, Haley, you want to move us on to the next slide. So we've been sort of focusing as we go from slide to slide a little bit more granularly. Ian just said the key thing that I wanted to hear him say, which was talking about tools to do exactly what we were just speaking to on the previous slide. So Ian, you want to dive into it a little bit more and talk to folks about what we at Bravura can do and bring to bear on this?
Absolutely. Like, I think kind of a lot of the same fundamentals that apply to your employees, your people, are going to be exactly the same things we need to apply to these AI assistants. Where are they? Whose account? Who it manages them? What level of access that they have? Do you still need them? And are they compliant with your policies? Those fundamentals are going to be needed here. And then the key question is, okay, how do I find them? How do I visualize them? How do I make good decisions? And how do I alert problems? And that's where with Bravura Cloud, we're introducing a lot of these fundamentals. And so we just brought in people, for example, in our December release, we're introducing the concept of a person. And it's a great question. How do we really want to bring in AIs in the next quarter or two? Should we be bringing them in as a type of non-human person, as much sense as that makes? Or do we need to carve them out as their own independent thing, with their own attributes, with their own descriptive, like their own descriptions, their own characteristics of self that you're going to need there? And it's very timely too, because say like the SCIM standard that is being now actively worked on again here, they're actively having these conversations around how do we bring in devices and IoT. And again, it could be a very timely thing depending on what people's thoughts are here about should we be starting to think of AIs and service accounts as top level entities that need to be represented in our identity standards so that people can get the right tools in place quickly and cost effectively so they can make sure that this is being handled now rather than in 3 years when the cat's out of the bag and now we're all struggling to get control again under here. And that again, like the concept of how do you continually make sure that your AIs are compliant with your policies? Like again, policy could be that every AI system must have an owner. If AI assistants use passwords to talk to systems, making sure that the passwords to those accounts are being rotated periodically, making sure that you certify their existence periodically. And again, if it's a sensitive thing, like something like an AI that's assisting you with a production environment, as much as that might be a little scary, I'm sure a few of us are going to push a few boundaries on there, for better or for worse. And again, treat them just like a person. Would you entrust a person with that level of access? And if the answer to that is no, then remove that access to the AI. And if the answer is that you would trust a person with that, you still need to have sober second thought about whether or not the AI it can be trusted with that due to, the challenge around accountability. Or who do you transfer that accountability onto? Who owns that AI? Because they would have to take on that accountability if they were to deploy this. And so that's where I think there's some real good opportunities here to, and something to think about also too. Where should these AIs be tracked? Should they be in your LDAP? Should there be in a directory store? Should they be tracked in a database that you'll require? And again, how do you give them accounts or access to the different systems that they're going to need to assist you with? And how do you track third-party AIs that you're given access to, similar to a contractor or a supplier or a research partner here? How do you track them with entities that are affiliated with your organization? Those are going to be fun ones to talk through, I think, quite a bit in the next 6 to 12 months, because this is going to come pretty quickly, I think, for a number of us. So,
Absolutely. Jim, did you want to chime in any about tool sets or compliance, or should we move toward Q&A?
Yeah, I think we could probably move toward Q&A. The one thing I would say is, if anybody needs a second blush in terms of, like, this is a very complex process that Ian was just talking about, right? It could involve re-looking at your role modeling. It could involve looking at how your attributes are attributed to your identities and your LDAP structures, right? It could be, your ACLs may be a bit challenging right now. Your control lists are kind of used to a certain kind of thinking. This will require change. And,
Absolutely.
I think that's the thing. Like, it's not a situation where as AI grows, we do nothing. We can't do nothing. We have to do kind of whatever it takes to manage effectively. And as Ian said, there's great power here for self-healing and to make us ever better. But there's also great power to get way out of control and cause extreme danger. So, and that's we kind of do a little posture and policy kind of assessments and help in this realm. So that's really all I wanted to add.
All right. Thanks, Jim. Haley, if you want to move on to the next slide. So we started this conversation today with sort of nudging you in the direction of what do you think you know about AI? What do you think your current landscape and your environment looks like? We certainly want to be there at wherever you're at in that journey. And so one of the things that we've got for you today, this is common sense, but sometimes, it helps to just sort of sit down and think about where your landscape is. And so we've got a convenient checklist that you can use the resource tab here in the webinar to download, or you could request it via the QR code that you see on the screen. But this will just sort of kind of capture everything that we've discussed in sort of a bite-sized format here. And again, just sort of nudge you to be thinking about where you are in your landscape. If Haley, Carolyn, you want to move on to the next slide. I'm going to kind of do this in inverse order. I want to talk about a demonstration. So you saw a couple of screenshots of what we call Bravura Cloud, which is uniquely designed to surface identities in your organization and at a glance give you great insight as to how those identities either connected to entitlements or group memberships or affiliations in your organization. And the punchline being that it's going to be really important to do that with these non-human AI assistants in your environment. And so that conversation of Bravura Cloud in and of itself would be about an hour-long conversation, and we'd love to have that with you. So we would encourage you reach out to us directly and ask us about how we're actually building capabilities into Bravura Cloud that are specifically designed to think through this AI assistant dilemma. And so we would like to talk with you about that. And then on the intiGrow side, Jim, if you want to wrap up and just sort of explain to folks what it is that you're offering in terms of pre-assessment.
Yeah, it's a gratis pre-assessment, and people are starting to come out of the woodwork now and say, hey, you know, as we discuss other items and we talk about how much of your technical team has AI assistant capability now, and people say, I have no idea, or I don't know what they're doing or what we're doing, because that's their own personal thing. But really, it's not their personal thing anymore, right? That data is all potentially going to be shareable on both sides. So, um, you know, what we basically do is sit down, try to determine where folks are in the voyage, and help to provide some guidance with regard to how they might look at posture initially, and then if they should want to take a leap to kind of like, we're going to create enterprise policy, you know, can you guys help us with that? Then that's sort of a project that we do. And then if people need help with things along the way after that, we talked about the role modeling stuff, we talked about attribute development or any of the strategy, um, you know, we can, you know, kind of help them think through each individual technical to do kind of that's in the checklist. So that's kind of what that entails. You know, again, it's complementary to kind of, you know, have the preliminary discussion to kind of make it, uh, I guess, make their AI world finite and kind of capture kind of everything out there. And it's not a bad idea to just kind of get a grip on what you think what you have versus what you think you have, because usually the answer is much different than you think. There are technical people doing things that they don't know are wrong, or they don't know are risky or anything else. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
It looks like we have kind of run a little bit long on this. Carolyn, I don't know, do we have a minute or two for Q&A, or?
Absolutely. Yeah. We actually have two questions that have come through. If anybody has any others, please send them in the chat or in the Q&A function. And we will again send out this recording afterwards. So if you have to drop, no worries. We will get the recording for you to rewatch, share. First question, what should I let our institutional resources have access to or not?
Oh, wow, that's a broad question. Jim, I'll punt that one to you.
Yeah, no, that's, I think I was just kind of going down this road. Based on, you know, compliance requirements that you have, based on PII requirements, you know, it's fair to assume that probably, I'm not sure what industry you're in currently, but it's fair to assume probably that marketing folks may have access to ChatGPT or other of the 22 new generative AI tools that are out there. You know, network zone segmentation isn't a bad idea, by the way, and keeping that away from the rest of the house. But I would say that if you would be willing to entertain a discussion, we can help you put context around there based on your specific infrastructure topology and goals and compliance requirements that are out there. You know, things that are managed well, including keeping log track of what people are using out there. If you want to create, for example, an AI assistant standard that's traceable, that's not a bad idea. It's difficult. It's a difficult question. I hate to say it, but it's kind of like the house construction question, right? Build me a house. Well, I'm not really sure where the bathrooms go or anything else, but if we did know a little more about the org, I think we can make very targeted specific recommendations for you.
Yeah.
That's fair.
One thing I might say on here, it just is one thing is if you're struggling to come up with this, think about the scope of the assistant being a person. You name it if that helps you relate to it, and think about the task that's at hand. And would you be comfortable with a real employee having that level of access? Just when you're gaming this out in your head about, you know, could this be safe? What kind of concern would I have here? Think of it in terms of a new hire having that level of access and what degree of comfort you have there. And if it's a third party, again, think of it in terms of if that third party was to not have your best interests in mind, what would happen with that data that you grant them access to or those APIs? Just when in doubt, humanize the problem and see if that helps with a little bit of clarity.
Couldn't agree more.
Yep. Second question. We're already struggling to do this. Oh, sorry, I just closed that window. We're already struggling to do this for identities. How do we add AIs? And I think your last answer probably applies here as well.
Yeah, like that's where it's already a tough problem. So if we could leverage some of the tools and practices we're trying to put into place here, that makes it a little bit more approachable. It's just that, of course, they're not the same as people. So there will be a few challenges here. But again, the less new stuff you introduce, the less opportunity for mistakes or other challenges to develop here. So if this is a strategy that can work here, it can help, like you're going to have more identities to manage, but hopefully still applying a lot of those consistent best practices that you've already been working towards here. And then adding a little bit of color and flavor when required, when you're introducing something completely new to the organization. That's when it could get a little challenging at times. But
And people need to be accountable for the AIs they create.
accountability, number one thing. If you can't name who's accountable for the assistant, then that assistant shouldn't probably exist yet. So
that may
Okay.
answer the previous question too, actually. Yeah.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you for that very insightful presentation, Jim and Brian and Ian. I know you're doing a ton of research in this area across the board, so we certainly appreciate it. And we appreciate the time that everybody took to join us today. We welcome you to join us again in the future. We will send out the recording and that checklist. Please keep an eye on your inbox. Thank you for joining today.
thanks, everybody.
Thanks.